All right, we're going to see if we can add Dr. Issa here. Please. All right. Dr. Issa, still learning how to use this app. So I sent it to the wrong number. All right. Since Robin contact, don't know if he's still on. Let me see. Let's see. Oh, Dr. Issa.
Yes.
Success.
Got you.
You know, the Nigerian style is be 4 hours late, so we're early.
We're just 4 minutes late.
Yeah, we're okay.
Just
We're okay.
seconds.
Nigerian style is 4 hours late. Let the food get cold, reheat it. We're on time.
Beautiful. Let's get started then.
Yes, I'll mute and let you go into the topic, background history of Marcus Garvey and UNIA.
Am I muted?
I am. I'll be mute. Oh, Dr. Issa, you can go into the topic. I'll just be sitting back and recording and listening.
Okay, very good. This is Dr. Jahi, Issa. We're going to have a conversation on Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This will be part of a number of series that we will do. But primarily today, we're going to deal with the background information on who, why a UNIA, why even the Marcus Mosiah Garvey, one, but more importantly, why a Universal Negro Improvement Association, why and how that organization started, what was happening before that, not only in Jamaica, but throughout the African diaspora in places like the United States and the Caribbean, and even on the African continent where there were hundreds of branches. So what was happening to Black people during the latter part of the last couple of decades of the 19th century? And so I think this background information will better help us to understand, where we go from here before we get into what the Universal Negro Improvement Association was about. So I think I'd like to start with the year that Marcus Mosiah Garvey was born. That critical period during the 19th century. What was happening? What was happening to the African world? Well, let's just start with Jamaica alone. Jamaica, or many of the Caribbean nations under British enslavement and British colonialism, many of those Africans there found themselves all of a sudden free. They were free of one form of dictatorship, but ended up in another form similar to sharecropping, which happened in the United States, in the southern part of the United States. Also, another thing that was going on with Marcus Mosiah Garvey right before he was born, many of the European powers who had ravished Africa for several hundred years had made a decision that they were going to partition Africa. They were going to divide it up into several parts because they were fighting England, Italy, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal were all fighting over who was going to control certain parts of the vast African continent. And so they had a conference that was headed by a British emperor by the name of Bismarck, a German emperor, by the name of Bismarck. And this emperor served as a mediator over which parts of Africa they were going to have. that each European power was going to control. Now, of course, some of you guys know this history. All you have to do is Google the Berlin Conference and German Emperor Bismarck. And so during this period where Africa is being divided up, they didn't ask African leaders, African kingdoms, if they could do this. They just did it because they had the power to do it. And remember, we're dealing with a period where after several hundred years, at least 300 years, Africa is ravished of tens of millions of people that were taken away, put on slave ships. They were Igbos, they were Fulani, they were Yoruba. They even went as far as the Nile Valley and got people. You had Nubians taken away, Egyptians taken away. You even had some Arabs taken away. They even went as far as Madagascar. It took tens and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from Madagascar. They took so many people from Africa that they depopulated various parts of the African continent. So there was no section that was not touched. There's not one African family, even those African families that found themselves engaged in the same trade of their own family members. Some of them found themselves on slave plantations throughout the American South, the Caribbean, and South America. But Africans did not control this industry. This industry was woefully controlled by Europeans. And this also jump-started what one Caribbean African black scholar by the name of Eric Williams called, in his book called Capitalism and Slavery. This is the beginning of capitalism itself, the international slave trade of African people. This is the beginning of European capitalism. This gives many of those European countries who still control a vast amount of the world's wealth. This is what gave them the upper hand. This is what gave them the upper hand. So in the midst of all of this, we have this person by the name of Marcus Garvey. And what's interesting about Marcus Garvey is that we have to look at his middle name to even get a glimpse of what was going on in Jamaica at this time. You know his middle name. His middle name is Mosiah. Now, why would Marcus Garvey's mother and father name their child Messiah? And he becomes the Messiah. He becomes the very person that they named him. And so if we delve a little into this, it's not hard to see that Marcus Garvey's family are African in their orientation. We now know through the DNA that Marcus Garvey's, on his father's side, they are Mende. They are part of the Mende people who come out of the great empires of Mali and Songhai. We know this now, thanks to DNA. So they are doing, obviously, because when we look at some of the biographies that are written on Garvey, Marcus Garvey's second wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, writes a book called Garvey and Garveyism. Garvey and Garveyism. And in that book, you can even go to Google and read the first couple of pages of that book. They talk about various African rituals that were done on Garvey when he was born. And thus, this explains the name Mosiah. And if you know anything about Africa, divination, African rituals is a part of the culture, even Islamic Africa. Although the Quran says that you shouldn't do it, but hey, that's something African Muslims are not giving up anytime soon. If they haven't given it up since the days of the living Prophet Muhammad, peace be to his soul, I don't think they'll be giving it up anytime soon. So it is my professional belief is that in the womb of Marcus Garvey's mother, it was prophesied that he would not only be special, but the divination must have said he was going to be the liberator of African people, that he was going to come into this world and do something very profound. And that's exactly what he did, because why would they name him at birth Moses? We know who the biblical figure Moses is according to the text in the Torah and the Christian Bible. We know he was the liberator of his people. And this is what Garvey, 20-something years after his birth, he burst onto the scene in Jamaica and then comes to the U.S. But I'm not dealing with those years of him coming to the U.S. now. I'm just trying to give us a picture, paint a picture of what is going on at this time. So if Garvey himself is doing African rituals in Jamaica, we must assume that this is going on all over the African world, particularly those Africans who are taken out of Africa, and some of them are freshly African born and taken into the vast diaspora. I'll give you another example of the same time period. And this individual, many of us know, Malcolm X or Malik El-Hajj Shabazz. He makes a pilgrimage to Nigeria. And I'm not going to tell you, I want you to tell me the name, do some homework, that the Nigerians gave him. Because what I'm going to tell you about Malcolm X has never been explained fully this particular way. Why did Malcolm X, when he left the Nation of Islam, why did he travel to Nigeria and they gave him a particular name? Well, Malcolm X, during the same time period, Malcolm X's wife, Louise Little, is born in the small, tiny Caribbean nation called Grenada. And what is interesting about Malcolm X's mother's grandparents, who she knew and lived with until they died, they were brought into Grenada from Nigeria in the mid 19th century, probably around the 1850s, 1860s. There's scholarship out here on this subject. We believe that have been Igbo. This is what we believe. Um, and this may be well known to the family. Just yesterday, I was watching an African ritual annual festival that takes place every year in Grenada. When I first cut it on, I thought that it was somewhere in Nigeria. But when I watched, I was shocked to see that this was Grenada. And they say they've been doing this ritual for over 100, this festival for more than 100 years, which tells me, similar to what was going on in Jamaica with Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the same thing was going on in Grenada with Malcolm X's mother's family. If they are born in Africa, which we know that they were born in Africa, they give birth, then they are dealing with African culture and rituals. The same thing is going on in the Southern at the same time, the 1880s. The same thing is going on in the southern part of the United States. These Africans are doing African rituals because they're Africans. They're straight from Africa. We have one case example that anybody can go and look at, and I recommend this book to everybody, by one of my favorite authors. When I was an undergrad, I went to undergrad starting off at Southern University in Baton Rouge, and I took a class on African American literature. And so we read several of Zora Neale Hurston's books. Well, Zora Neale Hurston wrote a book in the late 1920s that was only published recently in 2018. It's called Barracoon. It was a New York Times bestseller. But it was suppressed for more than 80-something years. And we'll have to pick another show and another time to talk about why this very important book was suppressed. But the book deals with what we thought back then was the last slave ship. We now know that it was not the last slave ship. But the book is called Barracoon. And it is a epic, true story of a ship of more than 160, some say 130, some say 160 Africans who were brought to the United States straight from Africa during a period that we call the illegal slave trade, in which I believe that most Africans or blacks in the United States came over during that period, during the illegal period from 1808 to the American Civil War. And even some came over after that period. But the book talks about, it's based on the accounts of a man by the name of Kojo Lewis. That was his American name. But in 1861, he and numerous of his family members and other people were snatched illegally, brought to the United States, and put into enslavement in 1860, I believe. I'm sorry, I said it's 1861, but actually 1860. And they were enslaved for almost a year until, for several years until the end of the American Civil War. There have been numerous of books written on this. The best book, in my opinion, was written by who teaches at Hampton University. Of history, Hampton University in Virginia, you'll see that scholar. She's an African American woman, and she was featured in a recent documentary on the alleged last slave ship. And Zora Neale Hurston, who writes this, they thought Kojo Lewis, time of her interviewing him, 30s, they thought into the United States and to have died. He died in 1835, I believe. And he tells Zora his whole story. How at the age of 19, he was in the military, and how his village was raided by these African Amazon women from Dahomey, and how they killed his mother, his father, the king of the small city state, and several hundred of them were captured, marched to the coast of what is now known as Benin, sold, put on a slave ship, sold by an American, a European American, otherwise known as white person. And this is how his family ended up in Mobile, Alabama. And they set up a kingdom. They set up a small kingdom right after enslavement, and they lived an African life doing African things, African rituals. They elected a king. They had traditional healers. I know the grandson of Kojo Lewis. I know him very well. In fact, one day me and him will come on and we'll talk about the book Barracoon and how they were even able to, I was able to assist them in helping take the remains of Kojo Lewis from Mobile, Alabama, back to Africa to the village where they stole them from. People don't know anything about this. This just happened. And so I was an advisor to the family on this, on how to do it. And, but more importantly, going back to Malcolm X, his family, his mother's grandparents were Nigerians who were brought over at a very young age. They were considered emancipated Africans, so-called. But if they were emancipated, why not take them back to Africa? Why pick them to Grenada? Because the British, although they were enforcing the illegal slave trade, they still were relying on this free labor that they were getting from Africa. But more importantly, to the subject of the background to Marcus Garvey, this is what's going on all over the African world, all over the African diaspora, and particularly because this is what gives birth to Marcus Garvey and the UNIA. We have all of these Africans. Marcus Garvey's first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey, on her mother's side, they were pure Ashanti royalty. And this was told to Amy Ashwood Garvey all of her life. And she even went back to Ghana and the Ashanti land, and they gave her family back their royal title and their land. So not only was Marcus Garvey extremely aware, I believe, that he's aware of his African background, there are obvious African rituals that have been done that allows his family to call him Moses. And they probably had an African name for that when he was growing up. Probably gave him that name. We do know that African rituals were done to Marcus Garvey during his childhood by his father, according to his second wife. We know this. Even Garvey talks about this ritual that his father did when he put him in a cemetery. This is a very ancient, sacred ritual of rites of passage. So we know that we're not just dealing with enslaved black people, we're dealing with African people who are conscious of their Africanness, conscious of what happened to them, conscious of the slave trade. Unlike now, we don't know anything. In Africa, we don't know anything, and in the Americas, we don't know anything. That history has been erased, not due to our own doing, but somewhere, somehow, we have people who don't want us to remember. They want us to lose that connection with the African world. But the people that grew up during the latter part of the 19th century, all the way up into the 1920s, the apex or the golden age of the Garvey movement, or as one scholar called the golden age of black nationalism, these people were Africans. Not only were they Africans in their features, but in their social and political life. How do we know this? This is before Garvey. Even in the American South, there was a movement, not only in the American South, but in the United States. There was a movement to start a black shipping line. This is 30, 40 years before Garvey. Black people were saying, we want to do trade with our brothers and sisters in Africa and the Caribbean. In the United States, there were several attempts. This is before Chief Alfred Sound, who does this in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. I'm talking about the 1880s to 1890s. There was also a movement, a strong movement in the United States to go back to Liberia. This is before Garvey. Garvey is not even born. I found in my research in places like Louisiana, they had a Liberian Day that went on for 30 years. From the end of slavery, 1865, all the way up into the beginning of the 20th century. In Louisiana, they had people coming from all over the South to New Orleans to celebrate African nationalism. This is before Garvey. And this is why I said on a recap of the Clubhouse conversation that we had, I made the statement that Garvey didn't necessarily bring anything new. What he brought was something that was well needed. That was his organizational skill, and that's what he was born to do. He was predicted in his mother's womb. In Jamaica, they had diviners. They came and said, this child is going to be the liberator. And again, I believe they gave him an African name. We don't know it yet, but people are doing the research. And we know that's how he got the name Mosiah. Why else call him Mosiah? And he becomes the Mosiah. He becomes the head of the largest black organization ever to be seen in world history and the progenitor of modern African nationalism. And as Dr. John Hendrick Clark reminded us in his book, Notes to an African Revolution, the major success and importance of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, according to Dr. John Hendrick Clark, was that he came to remind black people that they once ruled themselves in Africa before enslavement. And if they did it then, they can do it now. This was profound. One man. And to this day, all African nationalism, with the exception of Haiti and the Caribbean, Liberia, and Ethiopia, all has his birth and origin story. One man, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and those millions of African people who gave him the authority to lead them. And all he did a tremendous job in a very short period of time. So recap: the 19th century in the American South, in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, in Grenada, in Barbados, in Trinidad and Tobago. In Trinidad and Tobago, the African culture was so strong. When the British missionaries tried to wipe it out, they converted it into Christianity, and they still have Sango Baptist people in Trinidad and Tobago today. They have Sango Baptist Church where they worship the Yoruba Orishas to this day. We know due to archaeology that in the American South, all the way up into the 1930s and 40s, really up into the period of Brown versus the Board of Education, where the U.S. declared that legal segregation would not be state sanctioned anymore, federally sanctioned. So they ended segregation. But up until then, African people in the United States were doing those rituals. I grew up in an area called Kinloch, Missouri. It was founded by African people. They were doing it up there. I remember growing up, and we had a Juju priest in the community. I remember this vividly. I know this because my grandmother would go and talk about it. And so the background, the important thing is to understand as I talk for the next 5 to 6 minutes is that these are still African people during this time period. You're not dealing with slaves per se. Yes, they were enslaved, but they didn't have a slave mentality per se, because if they did, how do all of these people in the Caribbean, in Africa, in the United States join and follow Marcus Mosiah Garvey? How do they do this? If we're dealing with slaves, how do you do that? How do slaves wake up all of a sudden and say, we want freedom? We want to liberate the entire African continent. There's another point. There's a book that came out. I can't think of it right now, but remind me and I'll later give you the source. That talks about in the United States from the period of 1870s all the way up until the first decade of the 20th century, black people in the United States were talking about liberating all of Africa. They were specifically saying imperialism, that they were going to set up an African empire. This is 40 years before Garvey comes. And we find by looking at the official propaganda organ of the UNIA called the Negro World, that newspaper that was circulating at its height at 50,000 a week and translated into several languages and smuggled all over the world, we find that they had a section called the People's Forum. And in the People's Forum of the Negro World, you will find throughout that section, all the people are talking about is that we're going back to Africa. They were saying this in the Caribbean. They were saying this in the American South and in the American North, wherever there were UNIA branches, that they were going back to Africa to take control of the entire continent. That's imperialism. Not the type of imperialism that we're talking about now, but they were politically conscious. They were politically conscious. of who they were, and there was something about their politics that they were not concerned with just simply going back to the village or the town that their ancestors, that their mother or grandmother or great-great-grandmothers were taken from. They were concerned about liberating the entire African continent. And we know ideologically, we can trace this back to the 1870s. And this was prominent among the so-called black African American elite. I like to call them Africans politically. So this is background information. We're not dealing with ignorant people, despite the propaganda that was espoused a few days ago on Clubhouse. We're dealing with a highly skilled and concentrated set of ideals and goals that were frequently talked about for several decades. We're also talking about that these people were culturally African. How do we know? In the United States, we have archaeological proof that they were doing all type of African rituals. We have archaeological proof of this all over the American South up into the 1940s. Many of the I grew up in a sanctified black church in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri. And I remember I'm 54, I remember going to church and seeing these African rituals and dances. I didn't know that they were African rituals and dances until I started traveling to Africa. I made over 50 trips to various African cultures, studying the tradition and the culture. And I began to realize, I'm like, oh, wow, that's an Akan spiritual dance that lady is doing. Oh, wow, oh, that is a typical Wolof dance. Oh, that's an Igbo dance. It wasn't until I started traveling and I was able to do a comparative study of my own childhood and social conditioning to that of what I saw in Africa. I saw a lot more than that too going on in those churches. So, with that said, my brother, do you want to ask any questions? Confidence, are you there? Unmute yourself as we end this, because I've been speaking for the last 40 minutes. Confidence.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
I don't know what happened. I'm glad you're still here. I was trying to speak, but I actually had to I paused. I hope the recording goes through. I paused at 30 minutes, and we just started it. We're 2 minutes into another recording as far as screen recordings for video. But I didn't really have any questions. I know I tapped into this is basically being recorded for information purposes, because a lot. This is my personal opinion. When we talk about the Garvey movement, we're talking about signing up African chiefdoms and diaspora autonomous communities and Kojo Lewis Africa towns. It's like people know what they should be doing. This is what I feel, but they don't want to. Everybody's, I've even seen the most radical black movements in rooms talking about we're not all Africans, we're Native Americans, we're the 5 civilized tribes.
That's all propaganda, but we don't have to deal with them.
Yeah, so it'll be people coming here they have those family members that they want to live on a reservation and stuff. So don't be bothered by the small numbers. Now we're going to promote this far and wide. This is just for the record, so nobody ever says they don't know what the Garvey movement is. They don't have the resources. They don't have the bibliography. They can't use Marcus Garvey's name to promote their own agendas going forward. That's what people have been doing. So
Right.
this is very good. This is very good information, and it's going to be promoted far and wide.
All right, this is background information. So next week, what we will cover is Garvey is born and the socialization, what socialization is going on with Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And we're going to contrast that to the socialization of what's going on to African Americans in the United States, also during this period. What is he doing? Where does he go? Who is he most influenced by? A lot of people don't know that Marcus Garvey is heavily influenced by Booker T. Washington, right? But I don't want to get into details on this, on who Booker T. Washington, because there's a very good book by a sister by the name of Tyreen Wright. You should Google her, get her book on Booker T. Washington, the Pan-Africanist. Maybe we can interview her going down the road and look at her book. And she has a few YouTube shows discussing who Booker T. Washington really was. So Garvey and how dedicated he was to the African cause. And it could be possible that Booker T. Washington's mother or grandmother was African born, right? But that hasn't come out in any of his biography. And me and the author, Tyreen Wright, we've discussed this on several occasions. But his love and affinity for the African continent was there. And Garvey had been invited to come and meet him. But he died. So we're going to get into that next week. The first 2 decades of Marcus Mosiah Garvey before he comes to the United States, and what is happening in Jamaica, what is happening in the African continent, and what is happening in the United States and other parts of the African world. So with that said, I'm going to sign on off. I hope this is informative, and I want to share with you there is no substitute for reading. I know with social media we get bits and clips of knowledge, but if you want the full enhancement of information, you have to read. That's why I cited numerous of books we want to read. And if you really want to be really courageous with Marcus Garvey, or studies on Marcus Garvey, a very good biography came out about a decade ago by a Jamaican who used to work for the BBC. His name is Colin Powell, I think. And his book is called Negro with a Hat. Very good biography on Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And if you want to know more about a scientific study, look at Tony Martin's Race First. And if you're young and you're in college and you want a master's thesis subject, talk to me. I can give you if you want to study Garvey and the local Garveyism, if you're from Africa, you say, hey, I'm thinking about a real good bachelor's, master's, or Ph.D. topic. You want to study Garvey, reach out to me on my inbox on Clubhouse, and I will help you out. Okay, because we need more research on the impact of Garvey on the global, local areas all over the world. You want to most definitely look at the Marcus Garvey and UNIA papers that were edited by Robert Hill. I think the first 12 volumes were edited at UCLA. You can go online and look at some of those. And I think Duke University took over the last 3 or 4 volumes, right, on Marcus Garvey. And these volumes are all primary sources, and many of them are over 1,000 pages of just primary sources and rigorous notes. I know because when I did my doctoral degree at Howard University, I studied under the senior editor of the Garvey papers, whose name was Emory Tolbert, and who at that time was the chair of the history department at Howard University. He recently passed, peace to his soul. May he rest in peace forever. For all the work that he did and the mentoring of dozens of African Americans into PhDs while he was at Howard University. Okay, with that said, I'm going to sign on out.
Okay, Dr. Issa, Honorable Chief, thank you for all your dedication, lifelong dedication. And I give you my word that I'm going to make this spread. I'm familiar with Clubhouse and the people, the trolling and prop psyops. And I've kept up with your work over the years, and you are who you say you are.
Yeah, and the trolling and the psyops, we've been through more than that. We've been through worse than that. You know, a lot of us, they're Igbos. You're Igbo, your family is Igbo, but there were Igbos brought into Virginia in the 19th century, and they're still there. You need to find them. They're there. They left Igbo markings there. They're there. Those families are there. They're now finding out through DNA that they are Igbo, but some of that culture is still there. All right, so let me get on off, but we'll be okay, man. Everybody has a purpose in life, even the evildoers.
Yes, sir.
Even the traitors, they all have purposes.
I have one.
That's also a part of it.
I have one question. Because they say, well, it could be long, but that Virginia area, that's the Great Dismal Swamp with Nat Turner, right?
Yeah, I mean, you had an array of various African groups there, not just Igbo, but you had all types of Congolese. You had all types of, Khan. You had Senegambian people, all types. Okay, but let me get on off and we'll go from there because I see they're trying to interrupt my connection. All right, bye-bye.
Gang, bye-bye.